Hello and welcome, everyone. We are live here again, and we're recording a BJCP category style review session. That is a lot to say, but we are Craft Beer Nation, and we're going to do these little things every 2 weeks until we get all the way through all the categories. So be sure to subscribe on Stitcher and iTunes and that kind of stuff, and our YouTube channel, so you can miss not all of the categories. So we are category 9, so we got to go through 28. We might take a few side journeys for different things along the way. So lots of time to catch up and study up and pay attention and ask questions to get ready for the BJCP exam, which is kind of what our underlying idea here is. So again, we're Craft Beer Nation. I am Matt Miller. We've got some a panel of some folks here also from Craft Beer Nation. We've got Gil Mello, Doug Nolan, Ashley Baller, and Alan Huerta. And in addition to those of us that talk about beer, we've got some people that know about beer. Well, I shouldn't say that. Ashley and Alan are also our low-level judges. So we've also we've got some.
That was like worse than say that they're not judges.
Something like that. We have some high-level judges, and
we got a new host.
Something I want to get into. Maybe not this show, but these two gentlemen are both master-level judges. Nod your heads if I've got that right. And that's got to do with taking the tests and that kind of stuff and experience and whatnot. So these guys know their stuff. We've got Phil Farrell and we've got David Hausman. And these gentlemen know their stuff. So let's dive right in. And tonight's category is Category 9, which is officially recorded as Scottish and Irish ales. And, I know a lot of us have our favorite categories that we're looking forward to, and this is one of my favorite. Obviously stouts and porters are going to be some of my favorite beers live in there, but this one is, I just love the malt. I just love the sweet beer forward. I do enjoy a hoppy beer, but I also enjoy a beer that's focused on something else. So we're going to leave hops behind for tonight's conversation and move towards these kind of things. So we always start with Dave, so maybe we'll start with Phil this week, and we'll throw him onto the fire here, into the frying pan. And let's just kind of start with a little bit of history of this category, what kind of separates it from the other things, and maybe what some of the main differences are. What's different between a Scottish ale and an Irish ale?
Okay, let's start with what an Irish ale is. Scottish ale. Basically, the two things that distinguish Scotland were the fact that hops just couldn't be grown there. It's a dreadful climate, even though it's north latitude, so they get lots of sun there, or they could get lots of sun, for those long summers. It's wet, it's cold, the hops just don't do very well. So pretty much you had to import hops. So that was problem number one. The other thing that's very, best way to put it is, it's something that's extremely unique to Scotland, is they use peat for everything there. So, the water has a peatiness to it automatically. If you're using, some of the water sources they have there, they use peat to make houses, traditionally shelters. They use peat to burn in the fires. So, the whole place just reeked of it. So you combine that with just a really bad tax situation. And that's where the 60 and 70 shilling and 80 shilling and 90 shilling and all those other shilling beers came from, the fact that they were taxing things based on how strong they were. And then combine that with the fact that, can you guys hear me?
Loud and clear, keep going.
Oh, okay. So basically, they went with cask beers that were malt accentuated. There are even a couple of beers that are not styles, but you'll see people where they use heather tips and other alternative sources of bittering the beer, because again, hops were expensive and taxed and imported, and the Brits just didn't like the Scots, so any way they could kind of like stick it to them, they did. So that's kind of what went on the north part of that island. If you cross over to Ireland, what happened there was the water's different, and if you notice, obviously dry Irish stout is one of the popular beer styles that made it out of Ireland. Well, the Irish red ale was one of those beers where, like the Scottish beers, they experimented with dark grains. They played with a lot of things. But again, they went with very clean tasting beers, and the roast was actually thrown in there as kind of a, I shouldn't say an afterthought, but it was kind of one of those interesting ways to dry a beer, finish a beer off, and not have to use a lot of hops. So that's how it happened to work out. But like I said, Scotland is just unique from the water and from the hop perspective.
So it's fair to say that this is for beer, this is a fairly new style.
Say what now?
Would you say that it's a young or a new style when you think about beer history?
You know, that's one thing I don't know off the top of my head. I just, I would be lying to you if I said I knew for a fact this is what they were doing. But I would have to say they probably had been brewing for a long, long time. Again, Scotland tried to isolate itself from the rest of the UK, and it's kind of just the attitude that was going on there. Everybody was going to do what they wanted to do, and any way they could stick it to the British, they would.
And I think, what do you mean by new? I mean, certainly not.
I mean, you talk.
So
you really 1900s, 1900, late 1900s, mid 1900s. That's
probably
for beer history is not very.
Before that.
Probably before that. I mean, you really go back to porter was the beer that was being made in England, London at the time, 1600s, 1700s, and it wasn't until you started making the paler ales, because they could have, didn't have to have wood fires and that sort of thing, to start making a lighter colored malt, and started making beers that were from porter went towards the pale ales. And then in Ireland you were doing something similar. They were doing the stouts as opposed to the porter. They were differentiating themselves with what was the stout at the time, and the pale ale there became, the Irish red ale. And part of, I think Phil was very good with the explanation of the tax situation. And if you think about the way they end up taxing, they really couldn't measure alcohol that well. They didn't have the tools, so they'd measure the malt that went into it. That was the, if you knew how many bushels of malt or whatever went into a beer, you could tax it. Well, one thing that was not taxed as malt was roasted barley. So by using roasted barley, it wasn't taxed, and so you could produce the beer with some flavor and character, etc., and without having to pay the tax on that piece of it. And the other thing is, if you take malt and you put it in water, the malt will tend to sink, and those grains which didn't end up being malted will rise to the top and float. And the percentage of that is roughly the same percent that you end up with roasted barley in some of these beers, because it would float. Well, you're not going to throw it away. You roast it until it's black or very dark, and add it back to the beer, and you end up with the stouts or whatever, right?
So is the 90 shilling part of a Scottish ale, right? Because they had a beer.
Basically, it was anywhere from 60 shilling up to about 120 shilling was really up at the wee heavy Scotch ale, strong Scotch ale range. And as you recall, when we talked about the bitter, that we end up defining, not just the BJCP, but collectively the people who look at these things from a marketing standpoint and a tax standpoint, you had ordinary, special, and extra special bitter. Similarly with the Scottish ales, a 60, a 70, and 80 shilling Scottish ale, the boundaries there were tax boundaries. Today they're probably more marketing boundaries than anything else. The beers there's a continuum, though, really from the low end to the high end of that, in that these are malt accentuated beers. They do have they have enough hops to balance the malt sweetness. They're not overly sweet beers. They tend to be a little drier than some because of the use of some roasted barley in there. Peated malt, some of those are used. It was in drying the malt that the peat would be burned, and you end up with that flavor component. But I would say the majority of the ones I've tasted in Scotland and since, I think the smokiness is a real subtle, much more subtle than a peated malt.
Exactly.
And in fact, it really is probably more a combination of things. The yeast itself, the strains of yeast that are used, the fact that these beers, instead of using caramel malts, they use a lot of kettle caramelization. So the wort is put into a kettle. Instead of boiling it maybe for an hour, you maybe 2 hours or longer, and you get a caramelization that adds to the character of these beers, and that adds a little smokiness along the way. Though some people are using a wee bit of peated malt, and I think it's really nice when they do. But if not done right, it turns out to be sort of in the smoked beer category instead of a true Scottish ale.
Can I play off a couple of things that Dave said, just amplify them? When you're looking for really good examples of the style, the first thing is those first three categories, 60, 70, and 80 shilling, they're not very big beers. Like, we got in a little discussion this weekend. Ashley was at the same contest I was in Charlotte, and not her and I, but the other judge I was judging with, we were talking about this. We really like this 80 shilling, but you have to always recalibrate your brain that the top end of the 80 shilling is 5% alcohol, which might be a middle-of-the-road beer, but the bottom end of it is 3.9%. It's not a very big beer. And then imagine the 70 and the 60 being that much smaller. So you always have to recalibrate the fact that you're getting a lot of beer for the amount of alcohol that's in there for those first three styles. And as Dave said, there may be some smokiness, there may not, but it is not overt. There will be a little bit of caramel, but it's caramelization as opposed to just caramel malt. It will be malty, but it won't be sweet. And that's where a lot of people kind of fall off the wagon. They make mistakes like that, where they, try to make it too sweet, try to make it too smoky, try to, let everybody know there's caramel in this beer, and that's not a good example.
Yeah,
I think
good.
one thing that is always impressive to me that is Scottish ales, and they're very drinkable, very easy to drink for some of the high ABV. Maybe I just enjoy a lot of alcohol.
But the Scottish ales here they're session beers. They're in the same ranges as the bitter in the UK, so they're going to be session beers. It's not until you get up to the 90 shilling and 120 shilling, the strong Scotch, the wee heavies, that you really start to get alcohol, a lot of alcohol in those. And they are subtle. You're absolutely right. And one of my favorite beers of all time is Tranqueir House, a strong Scotch ale, wee heavy. It's wonderful.
I think commercially, there's just not a lot of lower ABV examples of the style. Everybody wants to do a wee heavy.
It doesn't travel well. It's the same thing we talked about with the bitter. It doesn't travel well. I mean, you see Belhaven here occasionally, but not a lot of it.
But Belhaven doesn't travel well either, though, does it?
Exactly.
Well, I was looking at the commercial examples of the 60 shilling on the BJCP guidelines. It's Belhaven 60, McEwen 60, McClay 60, Light. All are wholly cask-only products, not exported to the U.S.
Right.
Why does Belhaven stick with clear bottles? Because there's not enough hops to be worried about light struck?
They have it in a can too, Matt.
Do they?
Yeah, I get it in a can out here.
The 60 or just a big one?
A lot of brewers says they sell enough that it doesn't stay on the shelf long to do any harm to the beer. I don't know.
It's the Belhaven Scottish Ale. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't say like 60 or 70 or 80. It just says Scottish Ale. And it's got the little widget in the can. It's let me look it up. I think it's 6.5%. So it might be. It's dude. Unbelievable.
It must be their bigger beer then. I wouldn't think a light-bodied 60 shilling would be all that wonderful on nitro.
Well, you know, keeping that in mind, at least as far as the BJCP, when they were setting up these styles, the bottom of the wee heavy group is 6.5% alcohol. That's pretty low. I mean, that's not a substantial beer in my mind.
IPA, yeah.
And you know, when it goes up to 10%, imagine, you know, literally like a 200-pound person pounding a 120-pounder, because you know, 10% alcohol is quite a substantial beer. There's going to be, you know, 10,000 different things that you can bring to the table. But 6.5% alcohol beer, that's just one that you would expect to get just right over the counter in the bar. Nothing special about that at all. And that's where the 90 shilling for marketing thing comes in. There really was a 90 shilling that kind of sort of existed, and that was that beer that kind of fit in between the two. It's kind of a place where the weak, you know, Scotch ale could kind of sit and call itself a 90 shilling, where it's like, hey, you're going to get decent beer here, and there's going to be a lot of flavor, but it's really not a wee heavy.
Well, Odell has a beer that they actually call 90 shilling, and it's about 5%. It is pretty good beer.
So when you're judging these, let's kind of go through it a second. Look at aroma. You're not going to have really a hop aroma. If there is any, it's going to be very, very low, and traditionally it's going to be an English hop, but typically not any. You're gonna get the malt, maybe a little kettle caramelization with that. There's not going to be very much fruitiness. It's a cool country, and the beers tend to be fermented a little cool, so these aren't very fruity beers. A lot of esters produced during fermentation in that area, and they tend to sit for a while, so that I won't say they're not really lagered, but there's not a lot of diacetyl left, so they're very, very low diacetyl, if any, very low fruitiness, very low hops. It's all about the hops, or the malt and the aroma. And then appearance, basically amber copper colored. Sorry, my dog. Chasing my cat. They tend to be very clear, and not on draft. The head doesn't stick around too long, but unless you get it with a hand pump, or maybe with on nitro, where the head will be supported. In the flavor, not a lot of alcohol, except when you get up to the bigger examples. Again, not a lot of hot flavor, maybe a little, but not much. The malt, a little bit of this smokiness, but again, don't confuse it with a smoked beer. It's going to be a subtle kind of smokiness to that. And again, no diacetyl, no fruitiness in the flavor, or very low. No DMS. Very clean, drinkable, quaffable session beers for the Scottish ales.
I think what Dave said is very important, as far as you're allowed to have a little bit of diacetyl, but the impression is it's a clean beer. You're allowed to have a little bit of hop, but the impression is it's a malty beer. You're allowed to have a lot of little itty-bitty things to tell you that, yeah, it is an ale, but nothing should stick out. If it does, then there's an issue.
Yeah, yeah.
So I had a 60 to 90 chilling this week just to try it, and then I noticed that they got sweeter as they go higher. Is that just maybe the beers I tried, or that's normal as you go higher?
I would say they can be, but that doesn't mean they have a range that you can do, you know, that's acceptable. And again, Depends on how much roasted malt you're using, how dark they are. The lighter ones tend to be a little maltier and sweeter. The darker ones tend to have that drying roast that evens everything out. And that's just, again, that's just a tendency. And what I was going to say was when you're brewing these guys, one thing I was going to say that when Dave was talking about the kettle caramelization, where you're, boiling the thing down, big mistake you can make is you start doing your beer and you go out of your normal habit pattern and then you say, I'm supposed to boil this beer down a lot longer than I normally would, and you've already added your bittering hops. And that's where you'll end up with a harsh bitterness that would be a problem. So you have to make sure, if you're going to boil the thing down, check your gravity, and don't add your hops until probably like the last 60 minutes or so. The dog agrees.
Yes.
So I stepped away, so somebody shut me down if this is a repeat. But in a typical, what kind of hops would you use here? You wouldn't want anything floral. You'd want something just for bittering. Is there a typical hops that you'll find in here? Or is it just...
Well, the same basic hops you'd find in the UK, though. The Kent Goldings, Progress, the traditional hops.
Target, Fuggles, any of those.
Yeah, Fuggles is a good one. Willamette is the U.S. version of that, essentially, or a derivative. That's all traditional. I mean, you do find breweries there today, brew pubs or small breweries, and they're trying to differentiate themselves in the marketplace, and you'll find Cascades of all things, an odd. So just because it's made in Scotland doesn't make necessarily a beer that fits this style. Don't think all beers in Scotland fit one of these styles. They're doing beers that they're trying to differentiate themselves in their marketplace as well. So they may be doing an American Pale Ale in Scotland, if you would, that kind of thing. But this particular style, Fuggles, Progress, Kent Goldings, that sort of thing.
But you shouldn't get much hop at all, right? Should be almost.
You should not. That's correct. Yeah. That's right. One of the Phil was right about the drying. That using roasted barley tends to dry out the finish in a beer a little bit. They tend to be well attenuated, and I think you're going to find that's true of all the beers in the UK like this. They're well attenuated beers. It's not a lot of residual sugars per se. It's some dextrins, obviously, for sweetness, but not a lot of fermentable sugars. None should be left, really.
When you taste a lot of malt, your brain sometimes creates the sugar out of nowhere. So a lot of times there's beers that have a perception of sweetness, but they're not really sweet.
Yeah.
Fullness tends to do that. Diacetyl, again, you can have a very light diacetyl. If it adds to the mouthfeel and everything else, a fuller beer tends in your brain. You add a little malt. You say, okay, it's malty, it's full. Your brain fills in the blanks when you're not getting a lot of hop character. It says, oh, it's malty, it's sweet. And it's really not sweet, it's just a perception.
The other thing is, somebody mentioned as the beers get bigger, they may be sweeter. Well, if there's more alcohol, ethanol itself is slightly sweet.
Okay.
And
actually, I was thinking here. I might have. I tried 4 beers, and I'm trying to remember if it was as I went down they got sweeter. I think the 60 shilling was the one that I thought was sweeter. So I need to look at my notes. Yeah.
And again, it could be just that individual brewer. A lot of times when people lay something down in a cask, they're expecting a live beer and everything else. They may have thrown in a little sugar, just to make it, fizzy, and it didn't work out, so it's sweet when it shouldn't be.
I always think of these as, especially the wee heavies is what I think of, and the dark caramel type character, and I think that's probably from the kettle caramelization, the flavor.
Yeah, that's a good point. So maybe we talked about the Scottish ales, which are the lighter session beers, and you go up now to the strong Scotch ales, the wee heavies, and those may have some caramel added, not a lot, but it's that kettle caramelization that really defines that, I think, personally. One of the ways in which homebrewer can make this and get there is when I'm making a strong Scotch ale, I'll take the first anywhere from a quart to a gallon of the strongest wort right out of the mash tun into a separate kettle, put it on the stove, and let that boil. And if that can go down to a couple cups while the rest of everything goes into the kettle and starts to boil. And then all of that gets added back. And use some of the hot wort in the kettle to rinse that pan out too, to get all the goodies around the sides that have caramelized on the side of that pot. And so you can force that caramelization.
Yeah, I was just gonna say. So you're almost making caramel with your first runnings.
Exactly.
And then reintroducing it into the rest of the wort.
Correct.
Wow.
Correct. It's wonderful.
I was going to say, Randy Mosier showed me that trick, and he was using it for some of the bigger German beers, the Bocks, where you can kind of create a lot of those melanoidin reactions in there doing the same type of thing, except you just don't want to really burn it too much. Caramelization is kind of hard not I mean, I should say, you're not going to get in trouble if you overdo it, where with if you're trying to create melanoidin reactions, if you start burning it, that is bad.
Well, all right. What haven't we covered?
back.
What haven't we covered? What haven't we covered? We want to talk about what it takes to judge in some of these subcategories here. I mean, things to look for, things to look against. I mean,
Maybe what you don't want to find in a beer, you know.
yeah. What's typical to find that you want to be aware of?
I think we talked about some of that with the Scottish ales. Maybe we could swing over to Ireland and the Irish red ale for that one.
It'd be good. I had to judge those at a competition once. That was fun.
And so what was your impression then?
Well, as far as like competition entries go, it seemed like it was the category where a lot of people who were just getting into brewing probably entered it. We got a lot of decent beers, but they had flaws ranging from fermentation temperature to like I had one that was under attenuated. Yeast character being kind of interesting. I don't know if they chose the wrong yeast, but it seems like it's one of those categories that people enter when they're first getting into brewing.
Yeah. So there, it's basically going to be a pale ale malt, enough roasted barley that you're adding color without really affecting. You're not going to get roasted flavor in that. And the one interesting thing about color is color has different, besides the color spectrum, there's a hue, right? So if you get say a Crystal 60 and a Crystal 120, and you use the same, get the same color redness or same color opaqueness through the beer, the higher Lovibond malt will give you a redder hue, redder color. So when you use something like roasted barley, you get really a very reddish color, and that's why Irish red ale from that malt. But you're not using enough to give it a roast character. That would be a fault. But it does add a little dryness. So a key hallmark of Irish red ale is this kind of drying finish to that. Mm-hmm.
And I think even though I joke sometimes that this category is the bastard stepchild of the UK, all the people they didn't like, the Irish red especially is one that commercially can be brewed as a lager, and it's really low on esters. I mean, we're talking like literally no esters. It's one of those beers that's kind of the depending on how the brewer wants to, interpret the style, it's going to be one of those ones where just basically it's going to be clean. The esters just are not there.
The roasted barley will give you that red color, right? That deep
Correct.
red color now.
Right.
Yeah,
And it doesn't take it a lot. I mean, you may only use an ounce or two in 5 gallons. It's not going to be a lot.
I find red ales underappreciated, and it's a style that I really like it. And I know some breweries are doing a more hopped version of Irish Reds, which kind of find it nice. They're walking a little out of the style, but at the same time they bring some flavor to the beer, though.
Yeah, I mean, nice thing about brewing, you can make anything. There are a few things that just don't work, but not many.
Yeah.
The acetal and works in some beers like the Scottish, where it's primarily malt, but adding a citrus hop like Cascades with acetal just doesn't work. It's a terrible choice of things you can experiment with. But otherwise, yeah, add hops to a Scottish ale and go for it.
Yeah, there's a restaurant brewery called BJ's Brewery. They do 2 versions of Irish Red, which is called Jeremiah Red, and they have a Goliath. If you think you don't like red ales, you should try BJ's Brewing Red Ales. They do an amazing red ale. Lots of flavor.
Their Goliath, though, it's an American red IPA. Their Jeremiah is a bigger Irish red. It's 7.2 or 7.5%, but it's quote unquote an Irish red. And then the Goliath is supposed to be a red IPA at like 8 or 9%, 72, 75 IBUs. The BJ's that I had it here in El Paso, wherever it was brewed and then shipped to here, wasn't very red. It looked more like a regular Imperial IPA, double IPA. Like it wasn't enough red in it, and it felt like they forgot like a malt.
Well,
it was still very good. It was still hoppy and proper like any American American red IPA.
Backbone, like the back mouth to it. I thought it didn't taste like an IPA though.
Well, you got to remember.
No, it was balanced, but I mean, you're gonna sit there. When I read Imperial Red IPA, I'm expecting it to be more of a malt. It was just enough for.
Right.
I don't know. It was for me. It was just one shy of being like perfectly balanced as an Imperial Red, is what I'm getting at. And the color wasn't there, so I felt like something was missing. At least here, it's different. On the East Coast, I guarantee you, what's being made out there is different than what's coming over here.
You got to remember though, a lot of these, they're just marketing names. People can call it anything they want, and there's really no, in terms of BP, the only thing that's called red is an Irish red ale, and it's the Irish ale as defined and brewed in Ireland. But from a brew pub or brewery, they can name it anything they want. And in fact, if you ever go to look up on the Brewers Association website, they have the style guidelines used by the Brewers Association for the GABF. And in that case, they're modified kind of each year based on what brew pubs are brewing. And you'll find much more of this kind of definition of other styles there than you will find in the BJCP.
You know what? It's funny, until Red Bull, if you put red in the title of your drink, that was pretty much code word for craft beer. I mean, I've got a couple of signs in my basement here, everything from Red Wolf to Red Dog to Red.
Killian's Red.
Yeah, and that was like the code word. It's like, wow, this is really a special beer, and when really it's just a slightly different color. That was all it was. It was a marketing thing.
And were Red Dogs or Killian's Red or any of those really truly craft beer? Were they with the BMC Creations?
Killian's Red was really, in its own way, revolutionary. I was living in Colorado at the time, and they came out with, Killian's Red, and it was like, I couldn't believe a major brewery was doing something, and the beer actually did. It wasn't just a color; it did taste different, and I was just surprised.
It's not a bad beer.
Yeah, I was just surprised that they were willing to do that when it seemed like everybody was just so committed to the yellow beer thing.
We had a girls' paint out event last week at the local Budweiser distributor, and while they do distribute Budweiser, they also distribute a bunch of craft beer. So we were doing all these different craft beer tastings, and then they gave us a blind taste testing of the Killian's Irish Red, and I don't know, like I thought it was a steam beer or something the way it tasted. It was kind of threw me off. It was interesting.
Well, again, keep in mind it's it's a very clean beer, and it can be a lager. It's totally, commercially viable and even stylistically viable to make it as a lager. It's one of the few styles, just like some of the northern German alt beers are made as lagers commercially. So it's one of those beers. It's going to be very clean. It's going to be about a little bit about the malt and a little bit about the way the roast plays in and the finish. But it's a fairly simple, just nice. Think Smittix, how just simple that beer is, but it's very nice to sit and have a couple of pints of that.
I guess it kind of goes to show that these are just guidelines. These aren't the rules to making beer, right? So, I mean, there's an exception to all the rules. So, you talk about a Baltic Porter, and in the rules of Baltic Porter or guidelines, a Baltic Porter is a porter brewed with a lager yeast. And then one of my favorite Baltic porters of all time, which at least it says so on the style on the can, is 3B's, which is brewed with an ale yeast. So, they just these are guidelines, not rules. So make beer that tastes good, and we'll try and judge it accordingly, I guess.
Absolutely.
Well, the guidelines again, without as the Germans would say, without rules there's chaos, and without the guidelines, I couldn't imagine. If I was going to run a contest tomorrow, beer contest tomorrow, it would take me a month to write my own special fill style guidelines for my content. So this is just the framework that you run the contest. It's familiarity that the judges have. And, with that, it's like, okay, you enter in this category. This is, what you can expect, and the judges are familiar with that. And that's kind of what we go with. And that's why it doesn't change that often with BJCP, because it's all driven by looking backward as opposed to looking forward. The Brewers Association, with their contest, they have 6,000 entries. It's just insane how many entries they have, and they're trying to keep the categories down. So they start in with a red ale, a kind of red ale, a really red ale. They just keep coming up with new categories to try and make sure they can differentiate between the beers and keep the entries down to a certain number.
Well, and that's the thing about the BJCP. Then you just enter it into the specialty categories and just call it a day.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that really makes the judging part twofold. So when you're judging beer, you're thinking, how does this rank to the style guidelines? And does it fit in the SRM? Does it fit to this? I'm going to score it based on these guidelines. But then after all that is done, the best of the best goes to a best of show competition, which is just, I don't care about all that stuff. This is a good tasting beer. Is that
no? In best of show, you can have two really great beers. You might have a great Helles lager and a great Baltic Porter or whatever, any of them. And it's at that point, is this a better Helles than this is a Baltic Porter?
Wow! All right.
Or a mild. And so part of any of the judging, I mean, if you look at the judging form, the last thing is overall impression, drinkability. Would you have several pints of this? That kind of thing. So that does play into it. But you're trying to have an objective measure. Otherwise, you'd have every judge sitting around judging and scoring high the things that they like and scoring low the things they don't like. And we all have our own biases.
Wasn't it kind of supposed to be kind of like a dog show, for instance, where the best of show dogs, it's this dog, is this a better example of its breed versus
exactly
this dog being a better?
You got it.
Yeah.
Well, I was misunderstanding that entirely.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, you get down to in a best of show, you can get some real good arguments about the fine points of, well, wait a minute, this has a little bit too much alcohol, or this has a little too few hops, or whatever. You're really talking about the fine points of style sometimes when it's not absolutely clear which is the winner, you know.
And going back to what Dave said about that is, once again, there's going to be beers that you're going to pick up and you're going to save, even though they've been eliminated from the best of show panel. And you're going to have your friends taste. You're going to say, you have to taste this beer. And sometimes what they've done is they've colored outside the lines. They've driven off the road into the woods and stuff like that. But as a beer, it's a wonderful beer, but it's kind of like, wait a second, you got into this best of show as a traditional Bach, and there's no way it should be this smoky. But it's just absolutely delicious, you know, that type of thing.
Yep. I brought home beers from competition on Saturday, and one of them is a chocolate peanut butter porter, and it's like drinking a Reese's buttercup, you know, peanut butter cup. It didn't win first place. I think it was second, but I brought home the second bottle because they didn't need it anymore, and I do.
Heck yeah.
So just to come back to this, so really, specialty beers couldn't win best of show.
In fact, they did win this. Especially did win the best of show.
So
It's hard, but they do.
How can you say best of show is to a style, closest to a style, if the best of show is like the wide open whatever the heck you got, throw it in here?
Well, again, it's trying to understand judging specialty, and I guess we'll get to some of that when we get to style 23, or even some of the other odd things like fruit beers and herb spice vegetable. But at that point in time, you're right in that there's not an absolute metric for what a chocolate peanut butter porter should be, because there may not have been one before. Somebody has done something special. But the key is the underlying porter a good example of its style? So you look at that style, that you can say something about. And then you have these specialty things. Do I get that in the aroma? Do I get that in the flavor? And how balanced are they? You know, how does it all come together as a package? So those are the kind of things you do when you're judging specialties. And I love judging specialties because there's it's the place where there's a lot of creativity.
What I was going to say was there's 3 fouls you can do with specialty. 3 basic fouls. One is you don't call your shot. So if you enter a specialty beer and leave it up to the judges to decide, like you just say dark ale, and Dave picks it up and it's like, well, this tastes like a porter, but oh my God, it's like a Reese's peanut butter cup, and you know, and then you're going, well, he just called it a dark ale. Well, what's so special about that? And that's the second foul, is when the beer isn't special. So, for example, somebody enters a beer and they say, I'm doing a saison and I'm using DuPont yeast. And you're saying, okay, so what's so special about that? I'm doing an Irish red ale and I'm using roast barley. You know, it's like, what is special about that? So that's the second foul. And then the third foul is if you claim too much. Like I'm doing a robust porter clone of Sierra Nevada porter with, you know, Reese's peanut butter cups and about 12 other ingredients, and you taste and you go, okay, I get the porter, I maybe get peanut butter, but those other 12 things are nowhere to be found. And you're basically over-promising. And you have to sometimes just grade them down for the fact that they don't really deliver what's going on. And just like in the fruit beer category, the smoked beer category, any of those categories where there's a base beer and there's something else, if whatever that something else is overpowers the base beer, or the base beer is there and you don't taste the something else, then they haven't delivered. So that's just kind of like a basic judging thing about those types of categories.
Well, Phil, you need to come to one of our Friday night hangouts because we absolutely hammer beers that overpromise. I mean, if you put coconut in the title of the beer on the outside of the bottle, it better taste like coconut. And we
don't mind.
we might not have sophisticated palates, but I know when
it
there's
has to
not
have
coconut in beer. What's that, Gil?
We don't mind if it's a horrible coconut beer, but it has to have coconut, right?
You better squeeze some coconut milk into that fermenter. I'm telling you what.
Well, sometimes they talk about ingredients, and sometimes it's a promise. If somebody said, I did this with 20% rye malt, and you can't necessarily taste spice, rye, but you can taste spiciness, then they kind of sort of deliver. But it's like you said, if the title is, this is monkey coconut porter, and you're going to go, okay, I don't taste any coconut.
My problem is sometimes the brewery says they use certain ingredients for mouthfeel or for body, Well, if it's not gonna have any taste of that product,
right? Really,
you should be advertising it. If it was,
maybe we're just jerks because if you say oatmeal, I'm not.
We are.
I don't. Snobs. I don't think I don't taste it expecting to taste, mom's oatmeal. I know that that's a body added ingredient, right?
No, but you could absolutely get coconut or oatmeal in a beer.
Yeah.
However, you got to do it the right way. You take that oatmeal and you put it on a baking sheet and you toast it in the oven. And then you brew with that. Right. It's going to be like eating an oatmeal cookie.
Dave's making me hungry now.
I like that. I like that a lot.
That's like the first competition I entered my Belgian chocolate stout in 23, and I called my shot like Phil said. I said Belgian chocolate, real Belgian chocolate malt, and with the Belgian blended yeast of a Saison yeast and an Abbey ale yeast, and it got ripped. Oh my word, it got ripped apart in competition because it didn't. I'm saying it's a stout. One. So now they're thinking, okay, I should be getting this, and they're like, I got color, and that's it. Then they're like, okay, chocolate. Chocolate's gone. And I already knew that. I mean, it's not like it was a surprise, but but I could have just left it in like another category and not called my shot, and it could have been on the complete opposite end. It could have been like, oh, this is great, and I've been like, well, no, it shouldn't be great because it doesn't have this. You know what I mean? And it's just going back to Phil. I wanted to say that before my doorbell rang, but yeah, I also entered a basil saison in the same last competition, the one Ashley and Alan just judged this past weekend. And I called my shot on there too, but I entered it in 16 in the Belgian specialty category, not 23, which I probably could have entered the stout in, but I didn't think of it at the time.
Also so spice or vegetable, if you're spicing, the spice is a big factor in the whole thing. You could say this is a category 16 saison, but I've used basil, whatever, and that would be different. I would say. That's not a typical ingredient. 16E, that's one of those problems because 16E Belgian specialty, it allows clones that are not part of the Belgian styles, and it also allows something special. So if you say, well, I'm making a Saison, but I'm using Cascade hops, it's like, well, yeah, that kind of works, but you could also call that a specialty beer special It's kind of weird. They give you that break if you're doing Belgian.
Right.
Okay.
Go ahead.
See, I entered it in 16 because I felt it didn't fit in the Saison because I had used the basil. Because everything else about it was in theory within the guidelines. It was Pilsner malt, like 5% rye, and oh my gosh, I can't remember the third malt. It was 3 malts. It was like 60-30-10 or like 75-25-15 or something like that. No, I don't think so. And then I used like a bittering hop, and then I had finished with Saaz hops. I did a Saison yeast. I even tried to keg condition it with sugar to bottle condition it to get that natural what I love about Belgians is that natural carbonation that's in the bottle, the re-fermentation in the bottle. But it never took. For some reason, it didn't take with the saison, so I ended up force carbing it and then shipping it off. But so everything else was pretty much within the guidelines except the basil. So that's why I entered it in the specialty, because I thought, well, if I say I'm making a saison with an herb, then I could get docked if I'd stick it in the saison subcategory versus the specialty, where if you are doing something different with it, that's where you want to put it.
Since we went off track, we probably should finish this. But I want to just say, if there's one beer that I had that had everything that it promised, was Hardy Wood Oak Age Gingerbread Stout.
Oh, the bourbon barrel aged.
That beer is everything with promise and more. So.
There's bourbon, there's ginger, there's stout.
All right. How about in the Scottish and Irish ales though? What have you had that's really delivered?
Old Chub.
Yeah.
Old Chub is my go-to Scotch ale.
That's a wonderful beer. That really is.
And that's a gateway for a lot of people. If I'm in the bottle shop and someone comes in who kind of looks around like they don't know what to get, the owner of the bottle shop says, "Hey, let Matt Miller talk to you." And I always take him right on over towards the malty stuff, because you don't want to take a new person and dump 100 IBU hop bomb on them.
Founders backwood blasting.
And Dirty Bastard.
And,
Dirty Bastard.
The Dirty Bastard is their Scotch.
Amazing.
One of my favorites is Duck Rabbit Sweet Heavy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Horse. Was it Dark Horse has a Scotch ale also. There's really, I can remember the name now. It's another really good.
I think I need to spend some more time with Belhaven, because I always look past them because of the clear bottles. So maybe I need to go back and try and give them another chance.
Field trip.
Matt, if you want their Scottish, again, I suggest you get it in the can.
Yeah.
It's far better. It's far better from the can than that clear bottle.
Good to know. All right. Well, I think we've kind of covered this topic from top to bottom, don't you think?
Yeah.
All right. And I feel like such a hypocrite, such a liar, such a fake, because I started this show saying, this is one of my favorite categories, and then I looked ahead at the subcategories in category 10, and I'm like, hang on a second, that's my favorite category.
What's 10?
It's American ales. Gotcha. It's like pale ale, love them. American amber, brown ales, love them. I think maybe I just have
13. That's what I'm looking forward.
Maybe I just have a thing with beer. I think it might have something to do with it. But
I'm looking forward to 17.
Well, now I want to go right on to specialty ale though, because I want to get these guys talking about that. So basically, what we're saying is tune in for the rest of the series, because we've got lots of great categories to cover, lots of great beers to talk about, lots of great information to share, and get yourself ready for the BJCP tests. So Ashley and Alan, I believe you guys have your tasting here this month.
Saturday.
Savannah, Georgia, going down to Savannah.
Yep.
All right, gonna make yourselves. I don't know what you do from now. You've already passed the written, so this is the tasting part that can rank you, right?
And that's a good thing about drinking beer. I mean, if you pass, you drink to celebrate. If you don't pass, you drink just, to forget
about your sorrows.
Well, hopefully sometime later this summer we'll get to celebrate. And if not, it's all right. We'll just take it again. It's all right.
Good luck.
Well, all right. Well, we are a craft beer nation. We lost Phil. Hopefully he'll come back for the after party or after the show's off, because he's fun to talk to. We are craft beer nation. We are doing this all the way through. We're going to go all the way through to the end, and we're going to make some judges along the way. I think by the time we get to the end, Ashley and Alan might be some master level judges. I don't know. It's going to be a while. But tune in every couple of weeks. We do one of these episodes. We love having you. We are on Stitcher, iTunes, YouTube channel, Craft Beer Nation. Subscribe to those things and find out when our new stuff is posted. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you, or watching, and we'll see you next time. So cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.